If I were to ask you what is the most American of calibers, there could of course be stated many different answers. 30-06, 223, 45-70. Honestly, it could end up being a fairly long list on what round you would say. Now, were I to ask you, however, what is the most American of the pistol calibers, there is undoubtedly one caliber that the majority of people would likely say. What's up, guys? Scipio here, and welcome back to another Cartridge Week episode, this week featuring the legendary 45 ACP. Now, before we get into the rather extensive and interesting history, use, and all that stuff, we will first do what we always do and take a look at the head stamp, which on the top, we can see Federal for the manufacturer of at least the case. I'm not actually sure if this is straight from a box or reloaded ammo, as 45 ACP is a round that I reload quite a bit of, and I can't remember exactly where I got this cartridge from. Though I do know that this is a 230 grain example as well. Despite it not really being that important of a tidbit of info, I was nonetheless curious and went and checked. Past all that, we then see 45 Auto on the bottom, standing for the caliber, of course, 45 ACP, which, if you weren't aware, ACP stands for Automatic Colt Pistol. Another thing to take note of is the primer. While most 45 ACP uses large pistol primers, there is a small amount that uses small pistol primers, something that does make collecting brass to reuse for the caliber a tad bit annoying. So now, in a previous Cartridge of the Week video, we had gone over the 38 Special, a round that, though it had been designed as pretty much an improved 38 Long Colt, would not end up replacing the 38 Long Colt as the mainstay US military pistol cartridge, and that honor instead going to the 45 ACP, which today we'll revisit a little bit of that history, but also add in what exactly happened to give the military a particular bias towards the 45 ACP. So now the US would, as had mentioned in the last video, adopt the 38 Long Colt alongside the M1892 double-action revolvers in 1892 as a replacement for the 45 Long Colt and its single-action Army pistols. Problems would be quickly noted with the cartridge's incredibly poor penetration during the Philippine-American War, where instances of guys shooting Moro tribesmen numerous times and at point-blank ranges, yet still having them running forward, would become a common occurrence. To quote Colonel Louis A. Lagarde, Antonio Caspi, a prisoner on the island of Samar, attempted escape on October 26, 1905. He was shot 4 times at close range in a hand-to-hand encounter by a 38 Colt revolver loaded with U.S. Army regulation ammunition. He was finally stunned by a blow to the forehead from the butt end of a Springfield carbine. Now, these problems with the 38 Long Colt's poor performance was noted fairly quickly in the war, and while the revolver wouldn't be totally replaced, it would be replaced in a decent number as old crates of single-action armies with 45 Long Colt ammunition were frantically pulled out of storage to replace as many of the M1892s as they possibly could. And this experience would begin to form the bias towards 45 caliber weapons that would ultimately lead to the creation and adoption of the 45 ACP. What would really cement the bias towards 45 caliber weapons would be the Thompson-Lagarde tests, wherewith they would test a handful of military calibers to determine effectiveness. The calibers tested were 7.65 by 21, 9 by 19, 38 Long Colt, 38 ACP, blunt and hollow point 45 Long Colt loadings, 476 LE, and 455 Webley. The tests were conducted at the Nelson Morris Company Union Stockyards in Chicago, Illinois, with both Colonel John T. Thompson of the infantry and Major Louis Anatole Lagarde of the Medical Corps being the ones in charge of the tests. On the first day, 8 live cattle were brought out and 7 were shot through the lungs with the various calibers, and the remaining 1 shot through the intestines with the 476 LE. The effects were recorded, and should the animal take too long to die, they would be killed with a hammer blow to the head. Now, things such as shot placement, round types, animal size, and even the number of times each one was shot varied wildly. And on day 2, the test would involve shooting each animal with each caliber until either it had died or a total of 10 rounds had been fired. Number on how many animals were actually used varies between Lagarde and Thompson. During this test in particular, jamming of some of the pistols occurred, further adding to the inconsistencies. The next set of tests they would conduct after featured a dead human corpse that was hung up. It would be shot at various distances with each caliber, and the sway they would experience would then be measured. Upon completion of the test, Thompson and Lagarde would release their official statement. The board was of the opinion that a bullet, which will have the shock effect and stopping effect at short ranges necessary for a military pistol or revolver, should have a caliber no less than 45. None of the full-jacketed or metal patch bullets, all of which were less than caliber 45, showed the necessary shock effect or stopping power for a service weapon. We are not acquainted with any bullet fired from a hand weapon that will stop a determined enemy when the projectile traverses soft parts alone. The requirements of such a bullet would need to have a sectional area like that of a 3-inch solid shot, the recoil from which, when used in hand weapons, would be prohibitive. Finally, the board reached the conclusion that the only safeguard at close encounters is a well-directed rapid fire from nothing less than a .45 caliber weapon. With this end in view, soldiers should be drilled to fire at moving targets until they have attained proficiency as marksmen. Of course, these tests were incredibly dubious given all the inconsistencies, and in a lot of ways didn't really prove what it claimed that it did. However, that being said, these tests would be the real kicker towards the military's bias of .45 caliber sidearms. Now, what would be the key event that would cause the creation of the .45 ACP itself would come from the cavalry. They had been more than impressed with the prototype semi-automatic pistol provided by Colt. However, they took an issue with its .41 caliber chambering, insisting that the caliber should be upsized to .45. With this, Browning would do as they asked, as well as upsizing the pistol, giving us the Colt model of 1905, aka the first .45 ACP caliber firearm. The US would later conduct pistol trials starting in 1906, looking for the best pistol to be chambered for the .45 ACP cartridge, and while bids were submitted by 6 different companies, only Colt, Savage, and DWM would survive the first cut. Now, for unspecified reasons, DWM would withdraw their 2 .45 caliber Lugers for the test, leaving Savage and Colt to duke it out. And during the second round of evaluations in 1910, Colt's pistols would run without an issue, whereas the Savage would suffer from a combination of 37 different stoppages or parts failures, which would ultimately lead to a Colt victory. And after some more tweaks on the model of 1905, we would arrive at the model of 1911, and more importantly to the caliber, we would arrive at Cal .45 automatic pistol ball cartridge, model of 1911, featuring a 230 grain projectile and sporting around an 830 feet per second velocity. This cartridge would be the mainstay in US military cartridge, and for a few years, the 1911 would be the main gun shooting it. The handgun as well as cartridge would prove themselves in the First World War, with both receiving gleaming reports from the front lines. In the case of the 1911, you really could say that the US military couldn't get enough of them, quite literally, as demand quickly outpaced supply and would lead to Colt and Smith & Wesson rechambering civilian-marketed revolvers to .45 ACP to supplement the lack of 1911s. Which, side note, that is actually also where moon clips come from. Their devices intended to give the .45 ACP the rim it lacked for better use in revolvers. Now, the end of World War I would see countries begin to adopt various submachine guns, and it should come as no surprise that the caliber of choice for the United States submachine gun would be their trusted .45 ACP cartridge, with them initially fielding small numbers of the classic Tommy gun and then later going on to more simplified designs as the years would progress. Over the years, the .45 ACP cartridge would actually serve in a fair number of guns, both pistols and submachine guns alike, and it wouldn't solely stick to just stay in the US, with plenty of other countries finding great use of the cartridge and in a wide variety of guns. However, as per the United States, military usage of the cartridge would begin to dwindle past World War II, namely in the submachine gun department, as though they would continue to use submachine guns for years to come, guns like the M1 carbine and later 5.56 cartridge firing rifles would ultimately replace any two-handed weapons using the .45 ACP cartridge. However, the M1911 would serve the United States for years to come post-World War II, until it would finally be replaced in 1985 by the Beretta M9 in its 9mm cartridge. This, of course, would not be an overnight thing, and the .45 caliber 1911s would stay in service for a little while longer until they could be fully replaced by the new 9mm handguns. .45 ACP, however, would still occasionally find use in niche applications by various military forces, with one such example being the grease gun, serving well into the Gulf War as the perfect PEW for tankers. Now, as per police, the cartridge would see a much slower decline, with some units even to this day still allowing their officers to carry handguns in the caliber. And of course, on the civilian market, the .45 ACP still does remain quite the popular round. And much like the military, it has been a popular round on the civilian market for quite some time. As tends to be the case, calibers adopted by militaries tend to become popular with the civilian market, and since its inception, it had been a widely loved pistol cartridge, being sported in a wide variety of pistols and pistol caliber carbines alike, and despite the diminished use seen by militaries and police in the 80s, it would take a lot longer for the caliber to really decline in popularity with the civilian market, and even then, despite it not being as popular as 9x19 nowadays, it is still featured in a wide variety of new production handguns and pistol caliber carbines alike. And this is most certainly for good reason. Aside from the obvious, like personal defense, the caliber is also great for a wide variety of applications such as hunting or competition that specifically uses .45 ACP caliber guns. And while ammunition costs have risen significantly, the caliber still remains decently cheap should you reload, with casings having virtually an infinite lifespan and bullets like the new polymer-coated ones being exceptionally cheap. Actually, it's funny, in regards to .45 ACP, I myself load the caliber as mentioned, and it was the first straight-wall pistol cartridge that I'd actually begun reloading for, as I just used to load up high-power rifle cases casings and like 7.62 Tokarev. Anyways, when I had initially looked up what lengths I was supposed to trim to, I came across numerous forums of guys mentioning how it wasn't needed for the caliber, with quite a good few supposedly having massive caches of brass from as far back as the 80s that they still were loading to this day. Now, I know forums are definitely not the most reliable places for true and accurate info, but given the sheer number giving out similar stories, and it's not that outlandish of a story, it's clear that to some capacity you can reuse the casing quite a bit. The 45 casing naturally, much like other very popular pistol calibers, would come to find itself being used for a wide variety of Wildcat cartridges, some fairly obscure in use and others finding at least a decent degree of popularity, which we actually do have one video currently on the 400 Corbin, essentially for the time kinda like a poor man's 10mm, taking the casing of 45 ACP and necking it down to 40 caliber, allowing it to be used in 45 ACP chambered guns after a simple barrel swap. So with all that history and such out of the way, what exactly are the specs on this American classic? Well, the 45 ACP uses a .452 diameter bullet with weights on average tending to be in the 185 to 230 grain weight range, and sporting velocities around 850 feet per second, all the way up to a little over 1,000 feet per second. Now, keep in mind this is the average for 45 ACP loadings, however, there exists quite a few plus P loadings, sporting velocities in the 1,200 feet per second range. And interestingly, there also exists some really light loads featuring bullet weights in the 90 grain department that claim to achieve velocities at an astounding 2,000 feet per second. The 45 ACP, given its incredible popularity over the years, has certainly amassed quite a fair bit of different loadings, and with this it should come as no surprise that aside from just bullet weight, there exists a fair bit of bullet types for the caliber. On average, you will see classic ball being sold and used, however, there are quite a few different hollow point and soft point options, along with frangibles, hard cast, polycoated, and even these very weird polymer copper mixed bullets. Now, speaking of weird, one odd thing with the 45 ACP cartridge is primer selection. The 45 ACP features casings made to accept the standard large pistol primers, what it had initially been designed and used with, and they also feature casings made to accept small pistol primers, something that was done a little later, with the idea supposedly being that given emerging primer technology, using a small pistol primer worked just as good as a large pistol primer, however, it was a lot cheaper to produce. I will add, like I said before, this makes reloading 45 ACP entertaining if you're just picking up random casings off the ground, as you usually do, as you gotta separate your brass based on primer type. It definitely slows down the process a little bit. But anyways, I think that is going to do it for this week's Cartridge Week episode featuring the American classic, the 45 ACP cartridge. I hope you all enjoyed the video as much as I personally enjoyed making it, and I will see y'all next time.